Let me know if you can see my screen.
You can see the screen, yeah.
Yep, TERFs and TIFs.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess as Natalie indicated, this is continuation, what we've been discussing, um, but kind of a separate topic in some respects, but hopefully we'll be able to see the connection. Um, and it's my hope that it kind of wraps up everything that we've been speaking about so we can um, move on to different topics. At the After last week's discussion, um, Emma or I intimated that we were going to be discussing trans identity and how we as radical feminists relate to it, and what being trans inclusive radical feminists should mean for us. Um, and then Emma shared a PDF by an author, the same person who wrote, I think, the book that she quoted from in today's Sabbath study. Her name is Brianne Fass. I think that's how you pronounce it. And it's titled The Urgent Need for Radical Feminism Today. And so there's a specific section in there that I wanted us to go through. And it's the section called TERFs as Boogie Woman. Um, Not sure what the meaning of Boogie Woman in that context is. Um, but there are interesting points that the author makes in the two previous paragraphs. So we won't read those two previous paragraphs in its entirety. There's just small sections that we can read together, because I think they reinforce the message that we've been saying for the past 3 weeks or so about radical feminism and what it looks to achieve and how it differs from liberal feminism. Um, in my studies, in the classes that I take, the purpose of them, and I think it's the purpose of what we do as a movement, is that we collectively arrive at what the truth on a subject is. And from my perspective, at least, um, that can't happen when we share positions and those positions aren't followed by, someone explaining what that position is. That's how understanding gets to become understanding. For instance, we may read a Bible verse or an Ellen White quote, and we may know what the word of God is saying, um, but we may not understand it without going deeper into what those words mean. So while I welcome disagreement in the discussions we have, I think it's necessary. I encourage it, but I think that that disagreement or agreement needs to be um, supported with someone's opinion or reasons for their disagreement or agreement. When we think of our movement, in my eyes, I see it as this unique entity that stands distinct in how it intersects beliefs about multiple issues, where we may see, for instance, radical feminism externally as having this belief about uh, one thing, about women's rights, while rejecting, for instance, marriage as a social construct, um, or socialists, for instance, or Marxists, or whoever it may be. There may be overlaps in our beliefs with them, but they would reject religion as an organizing principle. And so, what I see unique about the movement, about us and our belief system, is that we have these intersecting beliefs where we draw ideas, we draw inspiration from what we see externally in different movements that exist. Um, so I think when we dissect different ideas, we owe it to ourselves not to, I'll say, side with a particular school of thought that we see just because it's in opposition to another school of thought that we stand in opposition to. I don't know if you're familiar with the phrase, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. In this instance, I'm suggesting that the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend. So what I mean by that is, um, just because, imagine there's three groups, us, um, I'll say liberals and conservatives. Just because I disagree with a position that conservatives hold doesn't necessarily, and just because this other group, liberals, also disagree with this position that conservatives hold, doesn't necessarily mean that I'm forced or obligated to agree with the entirety of this other group's position, the liberals' position. My point in saying all that is that when we come to what is truth, we have to form what is truth for ourselves. We need to fully understand our position. And that means discussing things that make us uncomfortable. It means this fully dissecting a particular idea, theory about how the world works, or what God has us believe. That's what being radical is. It's going to the fundamental elements of that thing. One of our roles is being observers, and as observers, that means to critically analyze the world, to sift what we see externally. We observe, and once we've made that observation, and we see oppression occurring towards a marginalized group, um, we have to go to its fundamental form to understand why that oppression occurs. And so when we approach any piece of writing, as I'm suggesting we're going to do today in reading this article, or at least the subsection of this article, first of all, we need to understand what argument the author is making. And thereafter, we rationalize whether we agree or disagree. We come to our position. So just because the author has a position that, at least at face value, we agree with, doesn't necessarily mean it's free from our critique. So I give all that preamble to say that when we're going through it, I'll ask questions and I'll prompt you to think about things in different ways. And my hope is that the questions I ask, or the questions that anyone asks in our discussions, don't shut our minds off from what we're trying to do and understand what is truth. Um, there's this concept about how our minds work, and we're all familiar with it in terms of fast brain, slow brain thinking. Another analogy to about this that another uh, psychologist gives is that our mind has these two facets, but they liken it to a rider that's sitting on an elephant. And so often we think of ourselves as being rational beings, as we, in everything that we do, we think about reason first, and then our belief system or emotions follow. But what they suggest, and I'm sure that we can intuitively recognize this, is that actually our emotions drive us more than our reason does. And so, in that analogy of an elephant and a rider, your elephant would be your fast brain, your emotional drive, your initial instincts or beliefs that you have about a given thing. And what you find, what we find as humans, is that that rider, instead of controlling your emotions in this journey of life about particular topics, it ends up being this thing that just looks for reasons to support initial beliefs that you have about whatever subject that you have come across. And so it takes deliberate effort on your part to avoid that, to distance yourself from having this initial belief that whatever reasons or logic that you come up with after the fact are just used to support that initial belief. Um, and so I guess that's the call, is that be mindful of how our human construct is made up, that it's normal that initial thoughts or beliefs about a topic are driven by emotion. They're driven by instinct. And we usually justify those beliefs with our logic thereafter. And I think someone intimated this in the study that Emma did. I can't remember what the comment was in its entirety. It was about what Gillette did when they were trying to sell more razors. They came up with this thing, and then they looked for a reason afterwards to justify this thing, women shaving. Um, and we look at that as negative, but we do that in every interaction that we have in life, really. Um, it's 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 normal. But in recognizing that normality, it's just a cautionary note for us to recognize that, if anything. So all of that to say, um, that when we do have discussions about things that do make us uncomfortable, that may go against your initial intuition, um, be open enough to have that discussion, and not block off initial thoughts about what a thing could be or shouldn't be, in your eyes, at least. So with that introduction done, we can go into what I did want to discuss today, which was, for the last few weeks we've been seeking to understand this duality of liberal feminism and radical feminism, and how liberal feminism looks to work within the existing systems. So in fighting for women's rights, having been excluded from the various systems of life for so long, women see that, okay, to be heard, to be seen, I need to be represented more. And so in we'll say the system of work, of this capitalist structure, I will fight for more representation, so more women are seen as CEOs. Whereas your radical feminist will say, okay, I get that that's something that you feel you need. Um, However, if we're going to eliminate oppression in its entirety, then we need to reimagine what this work system looks like as a whole. And the opening paragraph, opening section, should I say, of the document that we Emma shared, the urgent need for radical feminism today, demonstrates how feminists in the 1960s, 1970s drew inspiration from labor unions. So coming out of the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, labor unions fought for their rights because now workers were moving away from manufacturing in their own homes. It was predominantly done in families or in small communities with the creation of textiles, etc. You have machinery taking over this, and so companies needed big workforces, and lots of people were being exploited by these companies. And this is where capitalism really gets the fiery furnace gets its fuel. And so these labor unions fight for their rights, and they see that this whole system that's being created in front of them is the problem. And so this is the time of um while this is going on, at least, there's Marxism on the rise, there's socialism on the rise, and America and Britain and the West are fighting against this. And these labor unions then pick up on these thoughts from Marxist ideology, from socialist thinking, um, in wanting to get rid of this capitalist beast that's rising in front of them, and have a new system of how labor is organized within America, within the United Kingdom, and etc. And so feminists see this taking place, and they see the progress that these labor unions are making by demanding change to how they are being exploited. And they latch onto this, and they see that the only way that women are going to get their rights is by reimagining the existing order. Uh, if I can use a term that's used differently in various places, they start demanding a new world order. um, and they draw inspiration again from civil rights unions in the 1960s, from Martin Luther King, the Black Panther movement, in all that quest for racial justice. In that same era, you have feminists tag onto these thoughts, in wanting a new way in which society is organized. So that's a bit of a background that the article shares. But let me just share my screen again so that we can read a few statements that the author makes about radical feminism. Itself. So I'll need to call on a few readers from time to time, if that's okay. Can you see my screen? Yeah. Okay. So could I
Yeah.
get a reader just to read this initial highlighted bit, beginning radical feminism remains.
Don't want to read it.
Yes, please, Richard.
Radical feminism remains one of the most fraught, maligned, and misunderstood segments of the feminist movement. This is in part a consequence of the incessant distortions applied to the word radical, both in the mainstream news media and in colloquial conversation. Radical does not mean extreme or outrageous, but rather a process of going to the roots of something, of digging deeper and deeper in order to understand a system, structure, or phenomenon. Oh, sorry
Um,
about not
no,
understanding what that other thing was.
no, that's fine. Colloquial conversation. Um, And so, in essence, this is just reiterating some of what we discussed about, instead of associating the term radical with extreme or outrageous, let's think about it as going to the roots of something. And now, extreme can be understood in two ways. By going to the roots of something, you are, in essence, going to the extreme, because you're going to the the part in which hasn't been explored. When you think about a tree and you want to go to its extreme tips, you go to the roots. So there is that relationship between extremity and going to the roots of something. But in how extremity is colloquially used, that's what the author is trying to warn against, or this idea of outrageous. Um, there's a hand up, Charity or Blessing.
It's Blessing.
Hmm.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about, the point you raised about radical. I guess you spoke to it to some extent. That the word itself, if you look at it in the dictionary, even though it's not one of the primary definitions, but it is defined as extreme. Like, it will say very different from the usual, favoring extreme changes in existing views, habits, etc., etc. So I guess what I had wanted to say is being honest about that. That it does mean rude, but in the English language, it's also used to describe something that is extreme. So yeah, as we discuss the issue of radical and then also connecting it with feminism, radical feminism, I just thought that it would be important for us
Yep.
to approach it holistically and honestly, not to try and sort of like ignore
Mhm.
that issue. That there is that other definition of radical,
Yes.
which we acknowledge and deal with, as opposed to ignore and run away from.
Mhm. I agree. And I think the way in which we do that, someone can suggest otherwise, the way in which we deal with it is seeing the two as synonymous, as when you go to the extreme of something, you're going to its root cause. I think the point the author is trying to make, by distancing extreme or outrageous with radical is articulated in this secondary sentence, which I wasn't going to read, but we'll read it because I think it juxtaposes what the author has in mind with the way in which radical or extreme is used with regards to movements. I'll read it. As such, the phrase radical right is really a misnomer, as the far right conservative movement in this country, America, and in much of the world has little interest in uncovering or understanding problems at their roots. Rather, much of their politics relies on reactionary, superficial, and willfully ignorant positions that reject deeper analysis. I won't speak to this latter part of the sentence, but the way in which extreme and outrageous is associated in colloquial conversation is with this reactionary politics. And I think that's where the confusion comes from. So definitely, extreme in its dictionary definition is related to this idea of radical, but how it's generally understood is not in the same way in which going to the root of it implies, at least. This paragraph, this sentence just articulates what I was saying at the beginning of where radical feminists get their fervor from, and seeing it tied to labor activism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Again, this is just about understanding the root structures of women's oppression. And now a second reader, um, just to read, the author now goes into the legacies of second wave feminism, because it's within second wave feminism where you see radical feminism become a prominent force in politics. There may have been radical feminist thought running through first wave feminism, but it's really in second wave feminism that's we see a lot of the a rise of radical feminism, at least. Anyone to read?
Yeah, I can read.
Yes, please.
In its earliest iterations and in conversation with the growing visibility of liberal feminism, second wave radical feminism wanted to look at the structural and systemic roots of patriarchy and sexism, with particular interest in how seemingly private experiences, sexuality, the body, spirituality, housework, emotions, the family, connected to broader structures that disempowered women and limited their freedom and autonomy. Interesting.
I'm gonna pick up on the last word you said and ask you to describe why you find it interesting. I wouldn't have asked if you didn't say interesting. So
No, I think the way she explains this, because I'm remembering how we spoke about the personal is political,
Mhm,
right? And I've always felt like I've struggled to explain what that means, right?
mhm,
So when she puts it together like this, I'm like, yeah, that's a good way of explaining the whole issue of how the radical feminism wanted to um look at the structural and systemic roots of patriarchy, right, and sexism, and go to take particular interest in the private experiences of people, right? There's different things that are considered as private, and then basically look at them at with at a broader structure, if I can say it like
mhm.
she's saying that, and see how they have actually affected women and basically limited their freedom, like she's saying. So she's connecting that issue of how these personal experiences or private experiences that people go through can actually be looked at as not so private, because these are the same things that are affecting people. So basically making them political, making them things that are supposed to be looked at by society, bringing them out into the public as opposed to leaving them privately and saying, well, it's family issues, you
Yeah.
know. But in those family issues, there's expectations, ways of living, norms that have actually affected women. So it's not so private,
Yeah.
you know.
I think that's one of the reasons why I found this article particularly interesting is because while I agreed with what the author said, I just found the way that they articulated some of the things really straightforward in a way that made sense. Like you, I have constantly uh wondered what this term, the personal is political, really means, and I've come to what I believe it means, but reading how the author articulates it, it just made sense. It clicked. Um, so yeah, I agree. I agree with you. And then she goes on to speak about liberal feminists working within the system and the problems associated with that. And she points out that liberal feminist ideologies really diminish men's social and political power. So if we were to think about, if we the liberal feminist ideal of getting more women into the workplace and more women CEOs, which is good, which is necessary, but that doesn't address the problem with the problem in society that men yield social power. So it doesn't stop that from happening. And only radical feminism can do that because it questions power dynamics um, as a whole in general. Um, and then the last point that I wanted to raise on this is this sentence where she says radical feminists not only wanted to target a wider range of oppressions, they wanted to engage in more aggressive public actions that challenged power structures and demanded far-reaching change. I found this interesting because for the past um, maybe year or so, as a movement, we've been thinking about this expansive definition of patriarchy. And at first, it I'll say boggled my mind how we could take this term patriarchy, which means, men over women in a simplistic way, and then apply it to other forms of oppression. Like, surely we should just have terms that relate to those forms of oppression. It's kind of like we're reappropriating this term patriarchy, or um, using it outside of its context. But then understanding what radical feminism seeks to achieve, I think, makes that more of a valid, if not only valid, but necessary conclusion to come to, of seeing this expansive nature of patriarchy as more than just how can men use their power over women. And this author is indicating that radical feminism is, while it's in this context, at least, seeking to address the oppression that affects women, it targets this wider range of oppression that's seen in class, that's seen in race, that's seen in age, in ageism. And by recognizing that all these different layers of oppression are built on the same foundation, then you can come to the conclusion that patriarchy is actually more than just the power of men over women. It's this expansive thing, it's this holistic thing, and it's questioning power dynamics as a whole and how it affects different minorities or different marginalized groups. Um, so that's that. And she says it here again: far more than their liberal counterparts, liberal feminists, radical feminists understood the role of race and class in women's liberation, and that the links between civil rights movements, the women's movements, and labor movement were critical. And this draws on this idea of intersectionality, where a person um, can experience different forms of discrimination, um, but it all emanates from the same foundation, from the same um, oppressive structure or system, if you want to call it that. And then she rearticulates that here. So that was just showing how, kind of giving third, fourth, I don't know how many witnesses we need to solidify what we've been discussing these past few weeks, and these differences between what really is radical feminism and what really is liberal feminism. Now, this section um, talks about radical feminism as it relates to transgenderism. And I had on my whiteboard just now TERFs, as in trans exclusionary radical feminists, and TERFs as trans inclusive radical feminists. So early on in our understanding of feminism and its different, I'll say, branches or ways of thinking of this fight for equality, we came to the realization or the conclusion that we are trans inclusive, that trans exclusive radical feminism is, we aren't that, if I can put it that way. And what we are is trans inclusive radical feminism. In the video that Aldertes did on understanding feminism, she laid out these two strands of radical feminism and intimated what we are not and proposed what we are. Um, maybe it's just my memory, but perhaps someone could elaborate on why we are not TERFs, as in trans exclusive radical feminists. And I think the author does this in a good way in these next few paragraphs, which we'll read. But yeah, does anyone have any thoughts as to why we are not trans exclusive radical feminists?
I've read that article. It's brilliant, as I said. All I can come to think of now is that TERFs with I, they believe that transgender women are not real women.
Wait, sorry. Say that again.
TERFs, TIFS, believe that transgender women are not real women. That's why they don't include them.
You mean TERFs as in TERFs?
Oh, yeah, sorry, yes, we are the TERF. Yeah, yeah. I
Mhm.
should know this. I did a presentation on it. Yeah, TERFs with TERFs. Yeah, they don't believe trans women are real women, and that kind of got my back up a long time ago when I read that. So that's thick, but I don't know what that article said. I can't remember, but it was brilliant what it was said about transgender and TERFs. And
Mhm.
yeah, that's all I can remember.
Sure. Does Eliana have any other ideas or suppositions as to why we are not trans exclusionary radical feminists? It was, if I remember correctly, and I could be corrected, it was just a statement that was made by Elder Tess, but it wasn't expounded on. If no one has any thoughts, we can carry on and maybe yeah, carry on.
Curtis, are you saying that why we are not against trans? Is that what the question is?
Yeah, in essence.
Okay. Because I don't quite understand transgender.
Mm-hmm.
Is it men becoming wanting to be women?
Okay, so
Or is it
let's
women? Well,
let's start off this exercise by defining a few terms. Give me a moment, as it would be helpful, as Emma did this morning in helping us understand what intersex is in that acronym LGBTQAIA+, that beginning T is transgenderism. And so, oh no, sorry, that T in LGBTQ stands for transgenderism. And so there are various terms that get mixed up when talking about this subject. So we've defined liberal feminism, we've defined radical feminism. The first one that we can define is sex. What do we, and I don't mean the act of sex, but when we think about sex, what, how do we understand that term? Anyone? And we should know this because it was intimated in a study.
Is it the huh? I'm looking for a word to describe it. Basically,
gender.
it's the sex that you are. It's okay. It's based on your genitalia, what you're born with, and that genitalia basically determines whether you're male or female.
Yeah. So there's this element of genitalia associated with it. I'm just going to expand on that, if you don't
Curtis,
mind. Yeah.
sorry, before you expand,
Mm-hmm.
I just want to understand the format that we are following in your presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Are we raising hands or not? Why I ask is because I think I've raised my hand like twice now, and Charity did it twice as well.
Yeah,
You
sorry,
didn't
I just haven't seen the hands. I'll be more cognizant of them. So
Okay.
yeah, raise hands. I just didn't have the chat open, but yes, please raise hands. What was I gonna say? Oh, yes, that was expanding on the definition that Charity gave. So there is this element of genitalia associated with it, but it is not limited to genitalia. If we were to think of sex characteristics as a whole, we would think of reproductive sex parts, we'd think of hormones, we'd think of uh, chromosomes, we'd think of everything related to the physical anatomy that makes a human that gives a human body that physical appearance. And that's related to what Emma was discussing. When we think of intersex, so it's this place. I don't want to say the word in between, and we'll get why I don't want to say in between, but it's this mix of what we typically associate with male sex parts and female sex parts, not just genitalia, but anything related to the physical form, if that makes men men or women women, and everything else. So that's sex. So yes, what Charity said, but further to that, I just wanted to expand it beyond just genitalia. And this may be a simple or simplistic reduction, but I'm just going to say physical characteristics. And then the other term that I wanted to define is this the term gender. And I want an honest definition. And we'll get why I say I want an honest definition. But yeah, can anyone give me an honest definition of gender? Okay. Yeah.
Are you looking for like? Sorry, I didn't put my hand up. I thought.
And if I ask a question, feel free to blurt out.
I heard somebody else though. They can go.
Carry on, Natalie. You were speaking already.
I'm not sure what you're looking for, but do you mean like gender, what you're assigned at birth? I'm not sure the question.
So that would be related to sex, like what Charity was intimating. Something
Okay.
that's
What
they
was the question
assigned you at birth.
again?
Define
What
gender.
definition?
Gender. Where did you go, Natalie? Okay. There was someone else that wanted to say something. Charity or Blessing?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I used to know this by it, but um, I think what I remember, it has to do with how with sex, it's binary, if I can say. But with gender, it's not it's more than just no, let me think about it. Sorry.
That's fine. Take your time. Anyone else want to have a go before I give the definition that I understand? Okay. So how I understand gender is
I was
that is that gender is this social or cultural construct that
yeah.
humanity has understood to encompass different roles or different behaviors or activities and attributes um, for people. So it's not like sex because it's unlike biological sex that's assigned at birth. Gender is about identity. So there's two aspects. There's identity, so a person's internal self and how they see themselves, and expression. So how they choose to express that internal self to the world in the way that they behave, in the way that they dress, in the way that they appear. And it can vary across different cultures and historical periods. So if you were to look up gender in the in one part of the world 3,000 years ago, and you were to look at said the same gender 3,000 years later in a different part of the world, it could be different because of this appreciation that gender changes. Now, I'm not asking if you agree or disagree with the concept. That's the definition. And so gender identity is this internal held sense of one's own gender, and gender expression is this external display. Does that make sense, Cedric?
Curtis?
Yeah, Natalie.
So for instance, just to maybe help Cedra, for instance, you're born a man, but you're
Let's go through it slowly, but slowly. I
yeah.
appreciate, yeah.
What do you mean? Do you want me to
As in,
shut up?
no, not in those words. I want you to make that point in a few seconds.
Oh, I forgot it. I forgot it by then. I forgot it already.
Try and hold on to it. I appreciate that you want to answer the question, but I'm just trying to break it down, if that's okay. So we have sex, where there's this thing that's a doctor will look at your physical parts and say you are a man or a woman or intersex based on your physical characteristics, or your genitalia, your chromosomes, your hormones, etc. And then gender, which usually is tied to a person's sex and gets assigned, usually at birth as well, in association with their physical parts. And from that, you get these terms cisgender and transgender.
Curtis, sorry, can you just say that again? I was halfway through the sentence and I didn't write it all down. Gender identity is this internal held sense of, I suppose you're going to say, social and cultural construct.
I don't know what I said,
No,
but
derailed.
it's an internal identity. It's how you see yourself in relation to these socialized roles or these socialized constructs of what male is or what female is, or neither of the two, or non-binary. So when we speak about male, female, non-binary, we're speaking about this idea of seeing yourself as aligning with these terms. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So we have these two things, these two terms that we've defined, sex and gender. And so from that, we can derive cisgender and transgender. So I'll first define what cisgender is, and then that will help us understand what transgender is. So cisgender, anyone? I'm not asking if you are cisgender, I'm asking you to define cisgender.
Okay, from what I understand, cisgender has to do with how, like what you were talking about, how gender is its internal self, right? Your identity and how you choose to express yourself. And if that's how you feel your identity, your internal self is correlating with your assigned sex, then you are cisgender.
Yeah, exactly. Individuals whose internal identification, whose gender identity matches their sex that they were assigned at birth, as you've said, they would be termed cisgender. So there's a match between sex and gender. And for the majority of people, at least, there's that alignment. However, we get, and Natalie, now I want you to, if you remember, carry on explaining what you were going to say before
I can't remember.
yeah.
I can't remember what I had in my mind, but I think I was just going to say that it's the opposite to what you've just said, because when you're transgender, you don't feel the same as what you were given at birth. So it's the opposite for transgender woman or a transgender man.
Yeah, thank you. So individuals whose gender identity, this internal how they see themselves and the internal gender differs from the sex that they were assigned. So there's there isn't this match or this correlation. And so this could be trans men. So that would be a female, someone who is assigned female at birth, but they identify as a male. And a trans woman would be someone who's assigned male at birth, however, they identify as female. And sometimes people don't necessarily change their body or go through hormone changes to reflect that difference. They would say, I'm trans, just because there's that difference between how they identify and what their assigned sex is. Does that make sense, Cedric? Or this idea of transgenderism?
Yes, a little bit. What, C, is that cisgender, CISS?
Yeah.
So what
CISG.
SG, what is it actually, is it short for something?
It is, I can't remember what it is.
It's a Latin
I'm
prefix. Do you want me? Yeah, it's Latin.
Yeah, go on.
CIS is Latin, and trans is from the Latin as well. But the cis means it's a prefix meaning on the side of, or the same, I suppose you could say. So it's on the side of your birth sex. So if you're cisgender, it means you were assigned female at birth and you feel female. So it's just you're cisgender, that you're the same gender as you're assigned at birth. And trans is on the other side of, or across from. So transatlantic, across the Atlantic. That's the on the other side of, meaning you're on opposite of what you were assigned at birth. You don't identify with that genitalia that you were, or that the way they identified you at birth was maybe male, but you feel female. So you're on the opposite side of. So that's where the trans and the cis come in.
But they, I know trans men that dress in, and they have very strong makeup on, isn't it? Well, this is what I just watched from television. And
Sure.
I don't know if you can't. Okay, that's one trans person. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I'm not saying that's how they are. I'm just trying to, because that's all I know. Probably because I never really looked it up, and I should. So trans, and they accentuate everything, or is it just what I've seen, and it's not really actually what happens?
So if we at an initial point understand this idea of trans as being where your gender identity doesn't align with your sex, that's the first thing. And then there's expression, gender expression, which will be how you choose to express your gender, this internal self. And that can be in various ways. And so I think that what did you use? Something about
accentuate
their appearance.
Yeah. Or
my
I
opinion,
mean,
it's not really a
like,
helpful way of looking at it.
Yeah, I know. That's why I think I probably want to try and understand it.
Yeah, I get you.
Yeah.
So when you see a trans man who puts on makeup, the idea is that they are expressing themselves how they choose to express themselves. And that could be with lots of makeup, wearing flamboyant dress. And so I'm not getting into the rights and wrongs or whether that's valid or not valid. I don't want to get into that. I just want us to understand.
No, I just want to have an idea
of,
because my idea is of that.
Yeah.
And I'll go check it up on and see.
Sure. Charity. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something. There's a time I think I understand where Cedric is coming from, because there's a time where I used to see these men. I think some of them are even influencers who would like put on a lot of makeup and make themselves appear as women, and they go to shows or they do different things, whatever. And I then learned later that there's those people are called drag queens.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
they're not
Yeah.
necessarily, I don't think it has
Oh.
anything to do with transgenderism.
Mhm.
I actually don't know what a drag queen is. I've just heard that it's a drag queen. I've
Yeah.
never really taken time to understand, okay, what are they trying to do? You know, that
Mhm.
kind of thing. But they're basically putting on a show, whether they're dancing or I don't know, whatever they'll be doing. But I don't think it doesn't necessarily mean that they're transgender, because they just put that on for what they'll be doing, and then they dress down and become themselves.
Mhm.
Right. Okay.
And before I take your hand, Emma, in fact, no, I'll take your hand. So yeah, just to affirm what Charity said, that's what we understand as drag, where men put on or
Women's
accentuate
clothes.
features of,
Yeah.
and I say in inverted commas, women's clothes. And so there's an argument about whether that's appropriate or not, but we'll leave that for another day.
Mhm.
I think the confusion may, just to address that point, may come from the fact that we would traditionally call those people transvestite, because vestite is vestment, coming from the word clothing, that they traditionally dress in the opposite clothing to what they're assigned at birth. So they are male by birth, but they're dressing up in traditionally female clothes, and that's transvestite, and that's a separate category from transgender. So
Mhm.
transgender person doesn't necessarily dress in the clothes actually, but doesn't feel like and once you've met one transgender person, you've met one transgender person. It's a bit like autism. You know, everybody manifests in a different way, in a shape or form, but the general characteristic is they don't feel that they want to be associated or assigned the sex they were given at birth. So I met someone who presented as male, but didn't want to, but called themselves trans, because they didn't feel that they identified with being male, but neither did they really identify with being female. And the only thing that kind of they stuck out on was the fact that they painted their nails. So they looked male, presented as male, wanted the pronoun they, but painted their nails, which wasn't typically kind of a male activity. So there was something about them which it kind of spoke like, I'm not comfortable identifying as a male. And where that comes from, obviously, that's where Kish might be going with this. But yeah, so it's the fact that they're just not comfortable being identified with the sex they're born at birth, which means they may go the other way, or they may not want to identify as anything in that sense, as the non-binary. They don't want to be male or female.
Yeah, I think
Um,
I've been mistaking it for transvestite,
Yes, I think
transgender. Yeah, I
yeah.
think that's what I've been doing.
Okay.
Thanks for that, Emma.
Natalie?
Yeah, just before you move on, I just wanted to say that drag queens can be heterosexual, non-binary, or transgender.
Mhm.
Just thought I'd bring that up.
Yeah, great. Okay, so now that we understand what those terms are, there's another one, sorry, that I want us to understand before we get into the discussion is, Cedri, I'll ask you. A stereotype. When we talk about stereotypes, what do we mean? What is a stereotype? You can relate it to any stereotype that you can think of.
Meaning, like for a woman, we know.
Anything.
Oh, okay. Like just say for a woman, she dresses in a certain way, she talks in a certain way, she acts a certain way. So that's a stereotypical way that we think a woman is. Um, and when you get the opposite, then um, you put a question mark.
Mhm.
Is that really a woman or what?
Sure. So you've related it to women, a more which is true, it's right, it's a correct answer. A definition that's all-encompassing would be, this is just from Wikipedia, is that a stereotype is a generalized belief about a particular category of people. So it's this general view or as it says, belief that you or society holds about said group of people. In the example that you gave, that would be women. So further examples would be stereotypical behavior of women is that they wear dresses, or they walk in a certain way, or their gestures are specific to women. And your stereotypical man would be that he's butch, he's buff, he's strong, he's aggressive, whatever stereotypes you can think of. So that would be your standard or your convention that you associate these categories of people with. And then this affects old people, young people, the stereotypical behavior of young people, of old people, of races, of ethnicities, etc., etc. So that's your stereotype. Okay. So generalized beliefs. Beliefs about.
We could say that we think all transgender people do drag, but they don't, do they? Because I've just said it's non-binary do it, heterosexuals do it.
Mm-hmm.
So are we saying it's what they look like on the outside?
Wait, sorry, related, what's your question related to? When you say they, who's they?
People, people who generalize them, who stereotype them. Are we saying, or anybody that looks at people, are we saying how, it sounds to me like we're generalize them how they look on the outside.
So a stereotype
How they look on the outside.
A stereotype could not only be how they look on the outside, but we could have stereotypical beliefs about what people think, or how they think, or how they identify. There's stereotypical things about the internal self that we believe as well. So it's any belief that you have that's this generalized notion about a category of people. So it's not just the external expression.
Like countries, you could have a stereotypical thought about people who live in a certain country, not just how they look on the outside.
Yeah. Okay. So we've gone through these definitions. Sidri, I hope that clarified your initial one. And what I had in mind was going through this this discussion of, and I'm wondering if for time's sake I should. I guess I will. And then it will just mean that we continue next week. Oh well. We will finish eventually, I promise. So the first part is understanding what we are not. So we are not trans exclusionary. And then I guess we'll have to do it next week, is understanding if we are trans inclusive, what does that look like? What should that look like? And what should that be? So remember all these definitions that we've given now, and maybe through the week you can start thinking about the question that I asked. In any case, so let's get to this article. It's 8:15. What time did we start?
7. Just gone 7.
Okay. So we'll get through as much of this as we can. And so we'll get through as much of this section as we can today. And then through the week, I need you to finish reading it. So can I get a reader? And while we're going through it, please remember the introductory thoughts that I shared about discussions and what the point of them are.
Where are we reading from?
from here.
Up until
You can just read up until, well, I'll say here.
okay, I'll read it if that's all right.
Yeah.
Given the rich and varied histories of radical feminism and their ties to other radical movements, it is all the more tragic that radical feminism is now seen, particularly online, as synonymous with the figure of the TERF, an acronym for trans exclusionary radical feminists. Indeed, most of the time, radical feminism is mentioned on social media is in the context of the rejection of TERFdom. This fusion links the histories, ideologies, and practices of radical feminism to the figure of the TERF, reducing the complexity of radical feminism to trans exclusion. This not only falsely represents radical feminism, it also promotes the false narrative that trans activism and radical feminism do not have common origins, goals, and enemies. The belief that one must either be for trans rights or identify as a radical feminist has problematic implications for trans liberation and women's liberation. For example, gender scholar Finn McKay has argued that women's rights and trans rights can and should exist in tandem with each other, and that arguments that pit them against each other are not only harmful, but misrepresent the goals of both movements. We can, they argue, advocate for both trans inclusivity and for helping women who feel traumatized by men's violence against women. They have pointedly said, we need to be focusing on that which makes egalitarian models so difficult in the first place.
Thank you, Debbie. So I started at the beginning by asking, we've taken this position that we're trans inclusive, like it's our default position, and my question was, does anyone have any reasonings why we are? So, like, why aren't we TERFs? And I think a starting point is indicated by this author, where she points out that if we recall what radical feminism is, from those earlier paragraphs, where she notes that radical feminism is looking at how people in society are oppressed and seeking to understand why are they oppressed? What systems in society oppress them? And so the first point that she makes in what Debbie just read is that, first of all, radical feminism is tied to this idea of being anti-trans. So if you were to ask people externally in the world what a radical feminist is, they'll tell you it's someone who's outrageous, who is reactionary, or they'll associate radical feminism with being trans exclusionary. And so the author is fighting against this notion. And then the second point is that these two struggles, these two fights are not exclusive. It's not one or the other. In fact, radical feminism has to be an umbrella term for this fight for trans women's rights or trans rights liberation, because it's seeking to lift up the oppressed and fight against, as that last sentence says, these models that we have in society that makes egalitarianism difficult in the first place. So if you identify or find any group in society that is oppressed, it would fall into this notion of radical feminism. And I say that with an asterisk because there's questions I have about that later on. But let's start off that with being the building block, that as radical feminists, we see the harm that is inflicted upon trans people, and we recognize that they need a safety net as well, a place in society. So that's where we start, and then we can start questioning things down the road. But if we just start from the premise that they are marginalized, they are oppressed, and they need to be liberated, then we can see that the goals are connected. Are there, I can't see hands up, so if anyone wants to say anything, please feel free to speak.
I just say something that I feel like I've always thought that a radical feminist, said it before, is someone, and you've said it, Curtis, it's someone who fights for equality for all people. Egalitarian, can't say that word.
Egalitarian.
Yeah, I think that's what a radical feminist is, not somebody who just fights for women.
So, if that is the case, I often hear this argument, and it's a silly argument, or it could be silly, it could not be, that, and it's usually applied to homosexual people or homosexuals, that, okay, fine, these people are sexually attracted to people of a different sex, or trans people are oppressed by society. They're not given a place in society. So, if they should be given a place in society because of how they feel, because of what they believe about themselves, then what about pedophiles? What about the lack of a place in society for pedophiles? Why is that different, Natalie? Why is it two different arguments? Because pedophiles would say, no, society oppresses me. It doesn't give me a place to exist. So why is my fight for being allowed to be attracted to younger girls or younger boys not falling within the realms of radical feminism?
I don't know what you're asking, but I'm a radical feminist and I'm an advocate, and I fight for the rights of pedophiles in my job, for their rights in the vicinity, like if it's in a hospital or wherever, but I'm not quite sure what you're asking. So no matter who you are, what you've done, I fight for people's rights as a human right. Obviously not in a criminal, if I was a lawyer and you committed the crime, but if you see what I mean. As an advocate, as a radical feminist, I fight for people's rights, human rights. Well, I don't know what your question is.
Yeah, so you don't fight for their rights to molest a child, do you?
Of course not. No, but I'm not a solicitor or a judge.
Well, I never mind.
No, go on, Cedric. I think you're touching on what I was hinting at.
Sorry, can you repeat the question again, please?
I guess what I was trying to understand or demonstrate is that, as you pointed out, this older person may feel that they have the right to be in a relationship with a child, which is what pedophilia is. I guess you'd have to explain more, Natalie, what that right looks like when you defend it.
Yeah.
Because in my mind, I don't see them as the same.
I wasn't saying I was defending someone's right to be in a relationship with a younger person. I'm just talking about in a situation where, say, you're in a psychiatric ward, every human, no matter what crime they've committed, you cannot be discriminated against, whether you're transgender, a paedophile, or a murderer. So I was just saying it's a human, everybody has a human right. Like you were saying, the question, how come we all be for transgender but not for a paedophile? And you asked me the question, I was saying, actually, I advocate the rights of a paedophile in the situation that I'm in my job. But I would not, as a solicitor, as a judge, advocate. Maybe if I was a solicitor and I had to be the solicitor for that person, I don't know how solicitors work, but I wouldn't be, as an advocate, I wouldn't be saying, yeah, it's all right that you can be a paedophile. no, I don't mean that. I mean, there's certain rights that a human has, human right, no matter what they've done.
Yeah,
That's
I
what I
agree
meant.
with you. I don't think that was my question.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can move on. But I
Okay.
guess my question wasn't necessarily about the human rights that a person has to exist. Like like what you've intimated, even a criminal has the human right to a fair trial. I was more so making the comparison between this trans individual's right to live out their life the way that they see themselves, the way that they are, and a homosexual's right to live out and be in the world and I'll say do the acts that a homosexual would, they have that right. And I'm suggesting, as I'm sure you recognize too, that a pedophile doesn't have that right to live out that belief in society. And so I was asking, why is it different if we recognize that radical feminism is this fight for their rights? So not related to that first part, but the second.
I'm not sure if I'm getting right, but one is a criminal crime and one's not. To be transgender is not a crime, but to be a paedophile is. So I'm not sure if that
Well, I
helps.
guess that's what the argument is transgender. Who says that transgenderism is or isn't a crime?
Because we're saying that a child, you can't have a relationship with a child because we have a law to say they have to be 18 to be in a relationship. If he's older, which he will be, he'll be committed a crime, wouldn't he? So he can't just come along and say, I want to have a relationship with a child when there's a law to say you can't have a relationship with a child.
What if
in
that law
that way.
didn't exist, as in some countries? Up until recently, the marital age, in fact, the marital age for children or people has shifted throughout history. Um,
I think we'd see it as patriarchy, wouldn't we?
Yeah, and plus the child hasn't got a right then.
Emma, then
Gotcha.
Richard.
Oh,
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of confusion about the whole thing about what rights. I suppose I think that's where you're coming from about when we say we're defending rights. I'm not sure if I was a little bit confused by what Natalie's saying about defending rights, and there may be some confusion about the fact that defending all rights, human rights for people, which is advocacy, which is distinct from radical feminism, and I still think or feminism in itself is gender rights, specifically fighting for gender rights. And I think that's where, I don't know if that's where you're going with this distinction between pedophile rights or pedophiles' rights, transgender rights, and gender rights, and that's distinct from human rights. I don't know whether that's
Not necessarily where I was going.
no.
Because when I prefaced what I said about radical feminism as encompassing this fight for rights for marginalized groups, for oppressed groups.
Mm.
And
This is what
so
we want. Yeah.
yeah, and so what I was kind of trying to draw out is that when we say we are fighting for rights, what rights are we fighting for? And what does it mean that we're fighting for oppressed people? And I gave this I'll say crazy example to try and get us to compare and contrast that thing to help us identify or understand what it is we are fighting for. Yeah,
Then
okay.
would you say human rights?
Sorry, could you please put up your hand?
Oh,
But
sorry.
I think we could say human rights, but again, human rights is a broad term, and human rights can be applicable to criminals as well, but it doesn't mean that we affirm that crime, like stealing or killing. I believe that murderers have human rights, but I don't affirm their behavior. Blessing and then Richard.
I think Richard had his hand up
Oh,
before.
okay. Sorry. Carry on, Richard.
I shouldn't be long. I think it's with the comparison that you made with a paedophile, it's definitely a fruit, I think, from patriarchy, and depending where you culturally are, geographically, for a Christian, it's most certainly unacceptable because their eyes are supposed to be looking up. But also, there's a documentary. I don't know what people think, whether they're to the left or to the right or to the middle. This 60 Minutes Australia, they did a documentary, and near the end, it was suggested that it's a genetic as well. So it is. There's a group of scientists saying that it is a genetic thing. So it's because it does infringe on another human life that's not able to make adequate decisions and choices. It shouldn't really be acceptable when I say shouldn't be, in a Christian environment, but in the heart of society, just like as patriarchy is, on the surface not acceptable, it's out there in the heart of culture. And if it is a genetic thing, it's they're just human beings. I don't know, they'd have to make some changes to make it into the kingdom of heaven. I'm quite sure of that. But it is something that's rampant, and with regard to expression of a transgender, they should be allowed to have a safe environment to express themselves. But because of certain geographical areas do have laws, there needs to be boundaries for in the home and outside the home.
Yeah.
When they're expressing themselves. That's what I understand.
Said a lot. I'll comment on that after this blessing.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that my understanding of feminism, the word feminism, the term feminism is not just fighting for women's rights. So women's rights is a component of feminism, but feminism, of course, I mean radical, but I didn't want to get into the radical liberal divide distinction. But just to identify that feminism basically approaches the issue of equality for everyone based on the premise of how people view women or people view the feminine. So essentially, it's challenging society's understanding and view of gender, right? And identifying that the only way we can achieve equality is if we change our view on gender. Where society currently emphasizes and also misunderstands the concept of sex and gender and weaponizes it as well. Feminism proposes to deconstruct a lot of the ideas that people have about sex and gender, and particularly how the feminine has been viewed, right? So because society's view of the feminine and how the feminine should be treated, and when I say feminine, I don't just mean women, but you could also see people that are considered to be weaker, for example, and insignificant, fitting under the category of feminine, right? So these power dynamics where you've got the dominant over basically the vulnerable and the weak, and the whole conception of what makes someone weak and what makes someone powerful and dominant, all those ideas are being challenged by feminism. So I'm saying all that because when you come to pedophilia versus transgenderism, you see that those that are under the category of transgender are victims of, again, society's gendered system, right? So they are actually hurt in many ways and oppressed by this unequal system, right? And whereas a pedophile is, in essence, aiding and abetting that same system, right, which we fight against. So feminism would not support or include pedophiles as people whose rights should be fought for, whereas they would include transgender people as people whose rights should be fought for. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. And I think that's what Richard too was intimating, is that when we see patriarchy and what patriarchy is, and how its tentacles touch different areas of life, we see power imbalances between classes of people, groups of people. And so what I wanted to draw from that exercise was seeing that when we look at oppression, when a radical feminist looks at oppression in society, and they see it in labor unions, so this capitalist system, it's tied to what Blessing intimated and how we view strong and weak, and the feminine and the masculine stereotypically. But they see oppression in that because this group or this class have power that is used to oppress this lower class that do not have power. So that's in your economic setting, in your labor unions, like we touched on, your capitalist system. In race, and xenophobia, in racism, xenophobia, nationalism, the same concept is used, and why a radical feminist would fight for the rights of those people oppressed because of their race, because of their nationality, their ethnicity. It's fighting against the system of power being used to oppress a minority. And so I gave this silly example, but it's not really silly, to demonstrate how pedophilia is, as Richard and Blessing have said, it aids and abets this system where older people use their power to manipulate younger children, as we would say. So I just wanted us to get to that point of what patriarchy is. And when we say this sentence where Finn McKay argues that women's rights and trans rights can and should exist in tandem, why are they connected? That's what I wanted to draw out, is why are this fight for rights, why is it connected? How are they connected? And that connecting link is what Richard and Blessing said, is that both oppressed groups, women and trans, are suffering from the same system that views a particular sex or gender in its fluidity as being the holders of power in society, and therefore having the right to oppress your trans individual or your woman in this instance. And it's that last sentence which encapsulates this whole thought, to this brief exercise, is that the focus is on the systemic problems. If we revert back to that in each of these thought processes, it will answer a lot of the questions we have, is looking at the systemic issues that lead to oppression and how power is used in that system to oppress. I'll read the next paragraph as we wind to a close. The author says, I want to argue here that the figure of TERF is neither feminist nor radical, and that lumping in and that in lumping radical feminists and radical feminism in with TERFs, we occlude what is radical and what is feminist about radical feminism. Notably, the label TERFs was originally created by radical feminists as a way to criticize and delegitimize feminists who held essentialist and trans-exclusionary views. Those two sentences were wordy, so I'll just break them down. The author is basically saying whenever we tie this idea of excluding transgender people from radical feminism, we miss out on what the point is of being radical feminists, and what radical feminism is about in the first place. And it ties back to that original thought that we mentioned about systems and power within those systems. And then the second sentence is pointing out that the person that originally started using the word TERF used it to point to the small segment within feminist circles who held essentialist views. Essentialism is this idea that traits are fixed at birth, is that gendered traits, a woman is a woman because she was born with woman traits. A man is man because he was born with man traits. And so that's essentialism. And you see it within, as is being pointed out, within radical feminism, and as in trans-exclusionary radical feminism, as well as in conservative movements. And so you can see this overlap between the two. It's really just the same social conservative thought. It is a bizarre framing to imagine that anything that excludes trans people is now read as radical feminist, when both radicalism and feminism have been underpinning liberation movements for decades. The way TERFs are represented in contemporary media, primarily by those not affiliated or identified with radical feminism, reflects a more general lack of contextualism. I won't. I'll skip a few paragraphs if that's okay. Can someone read this? This will be the last bit that we read for today. But there's a point that I want to make. So could I get someone to read from here, from with regard to TERF framework?
I'll read it if you want.
Yes, please, Richard.
With regard to the TERF framework, there were and are radical feminists who believed that trans people threatened the feminist movement. A few radical feminists, Lyrie Keith and Robin Morgan, among others, held essentialist views on gender and have been wary of including people assigned male at birth, AMAB, in women only spaces, etc., toilets, changing rooms, rape crisis, and domestic violence shelters, and women's political and social groups. These conversations have primarily occurred around discussions of physical safety and women's freedom from violence. Notions that male privilege infects trans women's consciousness and women's something's just happened then, and women's learned fear of people who were socialized as boys and men. Hang on, did I miss something there?
No, I think that's fine.
Notions that male privileges infect trans women's consciousness and women's learned fear of people who were socialized as boys and men. For example, Mitch Fest, founder Lisa Vogel, and others held that women who faced violence from male partners or family members needed space to exist without the fear of that violence. Notions of excluding trans people from women-only feminist spaces have also been introduced into conversations about the importance of connecting people assigned female at birth, AFAB, around issues of reproduction, pregnancy, abortion, and menstruation menopause. Some radical feminists have contended that shared reproductive capacity could be an organizing principle for women as a class case.
Caste.
Cast,
So a
okay,
class
yeah.
or caste.
Mhm.
Thank you, Richard. And so in that paragraph, what the author is essentially pointing out is that there were historically and are radical feminists who see trans people as threatening the feminist movement. And there's two reasons for this. One is that there's this fear that trans women, so people who were assigned male at birth, if you recall our definitions that we gave at the beginning, um, would inflict violence against cisgender women if tra trans women were allowed into women only spaces like toilets or changing rooms. So there's that fear of violence. And the second is that if you think of the women on this call, if you were to think of your life as a woman in society, and I were to think of my life as a man, we recognize that we are socialized differently, not just in our likes and dislikes, but also in our experiences that we have in life. The oppression that you face as a cisgender woman is different to me as a man. I live in the patriarchy. I have the privileges of being a man in that patriarchy. Um, So the fear from said radical feminists, or the concern, is that trans women, i.e., me as a man, I've been born and raised as a man who transitions to woman in my life, I don't have that lived experience that you have being born a woman and being socialized as a woman in life. I don't have the same oppression that you do. So those are the two concerns that they have. And then in the next paragraph, the author goes into addressing those concerns, whether they're valid concerns, whether they are invalid. We won't read it, but I really do encourage you to read and dissect and really go through this section in this PDF. We won't for time. I've gone way over time, but I don't know if anyone had any closing thoughts. Natalie.
Yeah, when you said about the experience, it's so true because those who don't accept, those radical feminists don't accept transgender, they, they believe they're not proper women because they haven't had the experience of childbirth. That's a big one.
Not just childbirth, but
no, it's one of them. That's why
yeah.
you said other experiences. I can't remember them. I forgot what's been said about 2 minutes after it's been said.
I think it says in the paragraph as well. Reproduction, so childbirth, and pregnancy, abortion. So if we clump all that in childbirth, but menstruation and menopause as well. So my sister came to me some weeks back and was like, Curtis, this trans woman at work asked for leave because she wanted menstrual leave. And so these radical feminists who will feel that that's taking advantage of their cisgendered lived experience, because said trans woman doesn't go through menstruation, doesn't go through menopause. And so as you pointing out, Natalie, said these radical feminists, TERFs, will pull up the card and say, you don't know what it's like to menstruate, to have a period, to have cramps, to go through menopause. So you aren't really a woman. And so they tie these experiences with womanhood. And as I said, in the subsequent paragraphs, the author argues against these arguments. But I'd like you to think of your own arguments against these statements or these ideas, because and try and challenge yourself and think for yourself, whether the arguments made by the author are valid, whether the arguments made by these trans exclusionary radical feminists are valid. But we'll close there for today. I'm sorry that we didn't finish. I really thought we were going to. I had high hopes. But hopefully that will, and please, please, please do read on it, because I don't want to read through this next week. I want to get to the point of what being trans inclusive means. So thank you everyone for your participation. As always, I appreciate it. Let's close with a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you for continually being with us as we understand what this inclusive kingdom looks like and what it means. I pray that you may continue to guide us in the right direction, and that we may come to our identity as a movement. There may be overlap with the different movements that exist and have existed, but fundamentally we will have a unique identity because it's a new kingdom that you're creating. So I pray that you may bless our discussions, bless our understanding. Pray that as we go into a new week, you may keep us safe. May we remember our identity as we interact with the world. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good week.
Thank you. Thank you.
Person.